Hello, Yad, and welcome back, everybody. This is Christine Ami. I am reporting back from my office to give you today's next lecture, which is going to be all about language, colonization, and decolonization components of that. So let's go ahead and jump right on into the lecture today. I'm going to go ahead and share screen so we can get started. Hopefully you guys can see that nice and large. I'm going to go ahead and move myself up here. So as I said, today we're going to be talking about language colonization and decolonization. One of the things that we really want to start stressing is how do we start revitalization projects? What is the significance of a revitalization project? What are the components of dying languages and reviving languages? Those are some of the things that we're going to be really taking a look at. So the right here, we're going to take a quick look at a video that's kind of going to give us a little bit more of a background of how language becomes the heart of who we are as Indigenous peoples. So let me go ahead and do another share screen. Let's see. Here we go.
We would play and we would imitate the whites. And that was it. And we played paper dolls. That was our games. And we made up our own toys and stuff like that. So learning English was really hard.
Imagine the first time you heard a language that was different than your own. When Nora Dauenhauer first heard the English language, that's what it sounded like to her. Just strange sounds. She grew up in Alaska speaking Tlingit, her native language, and was nearly 10 when she had to start learning how to speak English. Tommy Joseph is also Tlingit, but his experience was very different.
I don't speak the language. I know very little. I understand some of it, but yeah, just not there. My dad, my aunts, my uncles, my grandmother refused to teach them the language. She spoke fluent Tlingit, and she refused to teach them because she didn't want them to be treated the way she was.
In just a few short generations, many Native American languages were lost because the elders were punished for speaking their native tongues. Today, it's more common for the younger generation to speak English.
Well, I can't keep blaming it on my parents, because I'm an adult now and I can go and, get a Navajo dictionary and learn it myself. That's pretty much where I'm at right now, so. But one day I will.
Isabel Gonzalez is a fluent speaker of her Jemez Pueblo language known as Toa. Is that important to you to keep that part of the culture alive as well, the language?
Mm-hmm. Because it's so important now. That's how we learn our songs, and that's how we, when they're doing songs, that's how we understand what they're saying or what they're talking about,
Escoli, no kutsakuking manayan hopi matsiwa, no piu pari toahum bayan bahan matsiwa. My Hopi name is White Spider Girl, and my English name, so to speak, is Patty Tolahunga. And I am Ka'uwangwa, Corn Clan. I too grew up speaking English first. I continue to learn my language because it's the heart of our culture, our ceremonies, and our prayers. If we want to teach the next generation our traditions, we can't do that without knowing the language.
Our elder, Charlie Joseph Sr., who was very instrumental, and I owe a lot to him and his teachings. Him and his wife helped start the Sitka Native Education Program. They were fluent speakers of the culture and active in the culture that didn't want to see our culture die here in this community. So they got some of the other elders together and said, we want our children to know these things. We want our grandchildren to know these things. So they started allowing them to be recording on the reel-to-reels, the history, the songs, the legends, and I'm a beneficiary of that.
Today, Chuck and his wife Amanda are in charge of his Tlingit clan house in Sitka, Alaska. They set it up for ceremonies and keep the sacred regalia of the clan. Chuck helps lead the prayers in Tlingit.
Even though I don't speak the language fluently, I can still try to imitate what they're trying to put across. So I try my best.
The problem, I mean, a very generous estimate now for Tlingit speakers would maybe be 200. I mean, realistically, it's somewhere 150 to 250. We just don't know. There's also understanders. There's some younger people who understand quite a bit, but aren't quite over the hump for speaking.
Richard Dowenhauer has spent the last 20 years working with his wife Nora, teaching the language, as well as documenting and transcribing audio tapes of Tlingit speakers.
If it was a guru, ask me what do I want her to say? Anything, whatever you want.
No, you said whatever makes you happy.
Yeah, whatever.
That's the correction. I gotta stop it. I do that to everybody.
But if the fluent speakers don't correct us, then the subtlety of the language is lost. Emmy Whitehorse, who is Navajo, grew up speaking her traditional language and today can easily express her thoughts about her art in her native language. This is a piece that I did mostly in blues, cool blues, because I was thinking about the depths of the ocean, the depths of the water, and how things flourish underwater. Chuck says a native education program helped him learn more of the Tlingit language. Now his daughter is taking classes there.
When I went to pick her up the other day, she showed me a coloring that she did of the number 1. And on the bottom, she says, Daddy, look. And she held it up. She says, play. And I said, okay. What she said to me was the number 1. And it had the number 1 on there. And I said to her, I said, yes, good job in our language. I didn't speak our language growing up. So 30 years from now, I really don't think we're going to have any fluent speakers, which is really scary to think about. It's very scary. And we do our very best, like my wife and I. We try to learn from the elders as much as we can.
I'm very afraid that we're not working fast enough. I'm not working fast enough.
Despite Nora's concerns, the many language classes they have taught and books she and her husband Richard have co-authored are making a difference in the survival of her Tlingit language. Others may not worry too much about not speaking their traditional languages. In the end, it boils down to personal choice and what importance we each place on our traditional native languages and whether we will pass it on to the next generation.
So that is kind of one of our introductory videos to kind of start bringing together a lot of these thoughts and feelings and personal experiences that each one of us have growing up either on the reservation or in whichever locale you guys find yourself in at the moment. And so one of the things that we do want to think about, right? This piece is actually coming from Simon Ortiz. He is a Native American author coming from Acoma, from, I think he's still over at the University of New Mexico. But these are some of his thoughts in terms of the significance of indigenous language, and more precisely to what his language means to him. And he says that using the English language is a dilemma and pretty scary sometimes, because it means letting go one's mind, it means letting one's mind go willfully, although with soul and heart in shaky hand, literally into Western culture and intellectual context, a condition and circumstance that one usually avoids at all costs on most occasions. Even though I believe I did not have many over problems with it, learning to read, speak, write in English was fraught with considerable tension for me. As a result, years later, I admit I have felt uneasy and even disloyal at moments when I found myself to be more verbally articulate in the English language than in my own Acoma language. I have to honestly admit that there's a price to pay for selling your soul if that is what has happened. And so these are some of the thoughts that are closely associated, not just with identity, but with self-esteem factors and cultural belonging that many individuals feel in terms of where they are in their language fluency. And some of the activities that guys are going to be taking a look at this week is, okay, where is my language fluency level at? Am I comfortable with that fluency level? And do I see a decline, right? And what does that decline mean to me, or that resiliency factor mean to me? And so those are going to be the areas that we're going to be talking about this week. One of the things that we really want to focus in on this concept of language loss and colonization, right? So language loss, right, can occur on two different levels. It may be on a personal or family level, which is often the case with immigrant communities in the United States, or the entire language may be lost when it ceases to be spoken at all. So the distinction between these two is, okay, we have in families who are deciding that they're no longer going to speak, but there's a tremendous amount of fluent speakers that are found in other locales. Or we're talking about, it's not just the family actually is a microcosm of a larger, right, um, uh, uh, circumstance in which the language is no longer speaking at all anywhere. And so the latter scenario, right, the one number two, has become an all too common threat in indigenous communities in the United States because their languages are not spoken anywhere else in the world. Something to think about, right, especially from a Native American studies perspective, is when we look at the concept of being fluent in other languages, it's something that helped to facilitate us prior to contact, prior to that physical and economic transition. We were required to speak other languages. Even if we take a look at the Navajo language itself, it has so many variants, right, and different dialects depending upon geography. It's related to a larger Athabascan branch, which it's not just connected through language, but through oral history to all of these other communities that exist throughout the American continent. So when we look at all of these different abilities to be able to speak multi polyglot mannerisms, what we're looking at is that once again, when we talked about colonization and how the Europeans needed to create some sort of mechanism in order to identify who the enemy was, and from a very militaristic perspective, and then blanket create this title for indigenous peoples, los indios, that brings together the enemy under one branch. The same thing happens with language. Once we lose that plurality, right, we lose different trains of thoughts, we lose cultural connections, and then ultimately we fall back onto, right, one hegemonic state. And so language loss and colonization is very much intertwined when we start looking at it. And so this is coming from the Language Conservancy. If you guys get a chance to check out their website, just Google Language Conservancy, and you can take a look at this for yourself. But it kind of gives you a visual breakdown of the decline in languages indigenous languages throughout the world. And so if we take a look at this in the 1920s, we're here in this yellow area, the 20% to 33% language loss of our indigenous languages. And so when we look at that and we start tracing that throughout the years, here's 1945, right? That's going to jump up. We see we're taking a look at 50% to 67% of language loss is now being brought forth. We've passed the point, and when we're taking a look at 1920, Native Americans are not considered adults. We're not considered as if we have rights. We definitely don't have voting rights at that time. So when we look at that that area, our language becomes just a side effect of how to trace that. So when we hit that boarding school, right, the very beginning of the boarding school era, in those 1920, 1900s, 1920, one of the first things to go is going to be language, right? So by the time we hit 1945, right, we are full out in, right, assimilation policies, termination policies, and we have now fell into that 50% to 67% of language loss. So things are taking toll. Nationalism, urbanization, globalization is starting to take its toll. It's forcing us, right, to become part of this dominant language that is now evolving through economy systems, which is really interesting because before the United States took over the Navajo Nation, and even during the very early trading period times, we still spoke multiple languages. As a matter of fact, somebody who was able to speak multiple indigenous languages and non-indigenous languages became a very key nexus, economic nexus for the tribe or their clans or their communities because of their ability to negotiate for economic purposes. And remember, economic at that time isn't for profit, it's for, right, continuation of livelihood. So that's very different from here, where we're now switching over and everybody's starting to speak one dominant language in order to partake in an economy system. When we take a look at 1970s, right, 1970s, we are still dwindling around the 50 to 67% language loss at that time. We are now into our second stage or third stage of the boarding school era, a different type of boarding school than we were seeing over at the Carlisle, kill the Indian, save the man mantra. Now we're full out into making a Native American population part of mainstream society. And so when we're looking at that, how we see this slowly an eventual stop of intergenerational transmission of many languages, right, including Navajo. And not just that, when we take a look at that, and this is something that we were talking about a little bit ago, right, in another one of our classes, is that we're also taking a look at, right, this loss of communication and interaction and even, right, intimacy with older generations. If we no longer know how to communicate with our grandparents, how are we supposed to learn these practices, these ways of knowing, things that we should be doing or not doing if we can no longer communicate with them, and vice versa, right? We had this older generation, for example, I'm thinking of my grandparents who told my father and his siblings to go out, right? Learn the English language. Don't worry so much about Navajo because you need to be able to assimilate and make a living for yourself. And now they're looking at their grandchildren, many of whom don't speak Navajo, and are, there's a lot of judgment that's going on that's creating a tremendous amount of resentment for their children, resentment for their grandchildren, when in fact they also need to start taking a look at themselves and their own personal accountability and responsibility. So there's a lot of just overall tensions that that are surrounded with language and how language is used during these time periods. In 1995, we see us start to jump into that red phase, right? We totally skipped the 67 to 80%, and now we're in the 80 to 90% language loss within the United States. Right? Over the last quarter century, the 20th century, national politics shifted and began to shift to encourage children to speak their traditional languages. But funding for language revitalization remained at low levels. So yes, it's like people being in solidarity with events. Yes, I support native languages, but if there's no active movement, if there's no policy change taking place, if there's no funding being allocated towards this, if the community does not find this important, then it's just lost words, right? It doesn't mean anything unless that there's action associated with it. And so that's what we see in 1995. Native revitalization remained sidelined, and people could say that they supported it, but there was never any action to change that. And here we're at in the present time, right? We see overall other indigenous languages are becoming prey to that globalization mantra, and we're taking a look at, we're still hanging in the 80 to 90% range right here, right? As of today, 61% of the languages around the world that were spoken as a first language in 1795 are doomed or extinct, right? Although governments and peoples around the world have become increasingly aware of the language loss crisis, and it is a crisis, right? Policymakers had not allocated enough resources to substantially turn back the tide of this wave of extinction that's going on with language. And right now, 9 languages a year or every 40 days cease to be spoken. And by 2080, right, the rate will rise to 16 languages per year. And by the middle of next century, we'll be losing our linguistic heritage at a rate of 26 languages each year, 1 every 2 weeks. And so if we don't do something to change, right, what's going to take place? We're at a very crucial crux, right, where we have an opportunity to make these types of drastic changes, to make policy changes, to make economic budgetary shifts in order to kind of put our money where our mouth is. Do we have, right, the politics and the support in order to do that? And so those are the things that we also need to take a look at, because we can preserve them in very small individual areas, but in order to present and take a look at this language loss as a whole, we need to really start to factor in, all right, well, how do we make this change on a larger level? Because remember, decolonization isn't just talking the talk, it's about walking the walk. And so when we look at these numbers and we look at maps like this, they're quite grim. How and is it possible? And are we going to go down fighting, right? And so those are the kinds of questions that we need to start taking a look at. Now, if we return to this concept, right, of boarding schools as social engineering, as a tool of social engineering, because that's ultimately what it becomes. It becomes a vehicle for language loss. And it's a wonderful, military strategic operation that's taking place. When we take a look at, for example, why the Navajos were so fortunate to maintain our language, right, for so long as compared to some of, let's say, some of our Eastern board, is not only the mere population density, right, of non-native speakers and non-natives just in general, but we're also taking a look at when we went on our long walk, which tribes throughout the entire nation went to their long walk. It's not like we were set up and, this group was set up to Washington State. These guys were sent over to Oklahoma. These guys are going to go up to Nebraska. These guys are going to go down to Fort Sumter. They actually kept us together, which, unbeknownstly to them, right, to the United States government, by keeping us mobile and by keeping us together, ultimately kept our language intact a tremendous amount more than, let's say, the 5 civilized tribes, when they were put on their long walk, were spread out throughout Indian country in Oklahoma to several different reservations and broken up. Right. And so once they were broken up, or if we look at the rancheria system over in California, when the rancheria system was formulated, it was formulated geographically, not culturally, right? And geographically, depending upon where you were working at and what ranch you were working at, that's where your community came from. So you would find, a community in San Diego that had multiple different speakers. So instead of trying to continue that polyglot arena, both the people and the United States government decided that, all right, well, we're just going to make English a standard language because that's who's running the show. That's the engineering that's behind all of this military, strategic, social engineering of how we're going to colonize these people. And so that didn't happen with the Navajo people when we were brought into one area, and then we were allowed to come back. And for the most part, we traveled together and maintain that. So, and even returning to our own geographic territory, I think has, a tremendous amount to say about some of the powers about how we were able to maintain our language. Now, the language rates, Dr. Wendy Gray Eyes really presents a lot on the dramatic decline of fluent speakers and within the last couple of decades. What's going on, right? How do we stop that? How do we start to put a hindrance on those? Or are we choosing to leave the language behind and thus leaving behind many of our cultural practices? So I want us to take a look at real quickly this particular video and in one case scenario and how this one individual is trying to figure out where she's going to go from now, given the fact that she is in that weird space of feeling like she has lost her language and at the same time hasn't taken full force efforts to move one way or the other. So let's go ahead and give her some.
I was pretty young when my parents divorced, so I was placed in a boarding school. So I was more or less raised around children my age, not especially grown-ups. So we kind of grew up together, In the boarding schools, you don't usually learn your cultures and things, especially when you're that young. You're not taught your culture there. Lived with my grandmother until she died during the summertime. And then I went to stay with my dad. We all spoke Chickasaw. I didn't learn English until I got in grade school. We were told not to speak Indian because you're here to learn English. I think that I've seen a lot of changes that have progressed in education and caring for the people there, assisted more in getting their education. Bringing back the culture I think, is really important to the younger people because we're losing it. It's and I don't speak it very well anymore. I can say Nanta Chibana, Nanta Chihotifo, just real simple things. One of them is, what is your name? What do you want? And I can, just say like town, like a chumpa being town, I know. And those are the, just basic words that I learned when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. And it probably wouldn't even be made into a sentence at this point in time. Because, you don't have that much of a vocabulary when you're 4 and 5 years old.
Okay, guys. So that just kind of gives a little bit of a glimpse of, other tribes' experiences with language loss and their own personal stories. And I think out of the two stories that we did hear, a lot of it comes up to who getting stuck at placing blame, right? And so some of the things that we hear quite frequently is, oh, well, my mom never taught me or my grandparents never taught me. So, and we also find a lot of resentment in there. We also find out a lot of self-esteem and cultural esteem issues that are tied up with that. And as we start investigating that and digging through that this week, one of the things that we have to let go is that need to place blame and get stuck there. Right? It's kind of in that critical thinking. We need to be able to look at the spectrum, take a look at the histories that are involved in our personal rationale as to why we don't speak our native languages, and to look for the, empowering component of, okay, where do I start and what do I do? right? And so here are some of these interviews that were collected in Northern California about boarding school experiences, right? My grandmother's mom, she went to school during boarding school and she was whipped for knowing her language. She didn't want her kids to grow up like that, so she did not teach them at all. Another youth said, for me, the native language is important because it's my language and I should speak my language rather than other people's language. When I speak that language, I think it makes me more Pima, and I think that I can show it to people that I am Pima, right? So it becomes part of an identity filler, right? An identity component. And another, I'm sorry, these interviews came from Phoenix, from Mesa. These kids, they know how to speak Navajo, but many times they might be ashamed or they have self-hate within themselves that have been pumped into them. It's being told that Navajo is stupid or to speak Indian is the way of the devil. Many times older people will really encourage English so that children can make it in the white world. And we see, man, all sorts of stuff that we can really decompress in this particular slide, right? If we take a look at, I'm actually going to get a pen real quick. Okay, so that concept of self-hate. I remember going to a panel once from a student, a graduate student, I believe he was attending ASU, and he was talking about the association of the Navajo language with his parents who also suffered from alcohol abuse and substance abuse issues, and he remembers that the only time that they spoke Navajo was when they were intoxicated, and that intoxication normally led to domestic violence, not just between his parents, but also for the siblings as well. And so when he thought about utilizing the Navajo language, it wasn't something he ever was interested in because of those very deep traumatic components that were associated with that. So he had been working with, how do I overcome that and embrace my language and all of the positive and positive realms that could be associated with that. This also, right, that Navajo is stupid, right? That's what, a lot of people we hear, and we hear it also, in a very internally colonizing, which means that it's no longer non-Navajo telling us this. It's a Navajo who's telling us that we should no longer be speaking this language because it's stupid, right? Or that it is the way of the devil. We see oftentimes that it's associated with a very religious context. Around here on the reservation, we know of several religious affiliations that burn Navajo paraphernalia, that require their parishioners to burn their Navajo paraphernalia, and along with that, to stop speaking the language. In the same context, we know a lot of other religious affiliations which utilize the language as a propaganda device for proselytization, right? Well, we speak the Navajo language, we sing in the Navajo language, so come join us so that we can teach you Navajo. And so we see that happening often. The Mormon missionary churches, a lot of our born agains, not to say that that's what goes on 100% of the board, but we do see that as propaganda devices. So and then we also see, right, this encouragement to speak English so that they can make it in the white world, right? Once again associated with, all right, well, we're leaving behind the way that we were, and I want my children to have this different realm. So like I said, there's just a lot of things to unpack in all of these personal interviews. Here we go. We have an elder interview who states that this is why children have lost their identity, that they do not know where they belong. They can't speak Indian and they just go with the flow, which is sometimes not good. What can you say? And then, right, even this, just what can you say? Well, where's the active movement? If you find something that's so traumatic to the culture, so traumatic to the children, where is the movement, right? We can't just call out and point fingers and place blame. We have to find some sort of positive realm for us to deal with those kinds of psychological and colonizing experiences, those impacts of colonization that we start taking a look at. So when we take a look at that, right, research, what are the positive benefits for taking a look at language and reintegrating it in who we are as Navajo people. And it suggests, right, research suggests that structures of various language actually influence how children develop their sense of numbers, quantities, in the broader mathematical world. I was just talking about this in a STEM conference the other day, right? I was horrendous at math, horrendous. But if you put me in front of a loom, I could tell you how, right, different types of equations functioned, and geometric balances, and for me, that was a way for me to reconnect with mathematical solutions, is also a way for me to reconnect with language. When we take a look at words, words are a catalyst for dreaming, right, and inventing a different and future world. Right, we're at a very key moment, not only just because of the coronavirus, but because of all the social movements that's going on associated with Black Lives Matter, and the standing up against colonizing imagery that's portrayed in media, where we have an opportunity, right, to think about how do we want our Navajo Nation to continue? Do we want our Navajo Nation to continue as an English dominant, or are we going to do something to change that, right? And that's one of the things that when I'm thinking about the stimulus package, for me, a lot of that would be put into language programs and language revitalizations, even, making them part of requirement systems for enrollment, right? Is being able to identify clans and those kinds of things. Those are the things that, like I said, that would be a part of that invention component, depending upon, right, how important these kinds of topics are to you. And they're scary, right? That's one of the discussion questions that I have for you guys this week, is to think about that, right? If we were to make language part of our enrollment process and part of our requirements of being Navajo people, what's your immediate fear, right? What's your immediate reaction? Is it fear? Is it no reaction, and meaning that you are okay with it, or you're not okay with it? Those are the kinds of things that I want us to start to think about, how we can start reinventing the world and making language a priority. Because when we look at this, and this is especially coming from a cultural anthropologist and Native American studies perspective, right? Language is fundamental to our cultural identity. This is so for people everywhere, right? You have a unique expression system, and for this reason, it's important that people know their own language and they keep that alive, because understanding those contexts help us to communicate with who we are, as a people. When we started talking about in our previous class, right, about ontological belief systems, and we start thinking about, all right, well, who are our holy people, and how do we pray to them, and how do we talk to them, and how do we reprimand them when they need to be reprimanded? How do we talk to our animals? How do we talk to our plants? What language, right? And so you'll see a lot of people say, well, in any language is good language, but is that how that functions from an ontological perspective? So those are the things that, once again, like I said, we really need to start critically thinking about and finding out where we are at on that spectrum. Obviously, you guys can see that I'm huge into right, language, huge into language revitalization, but that may not be the case for you. You need to be able to figure out where you're at in that spectrum, right? So then the question becomes, how do we stop languages from dying, right? And the first thing that we need to really truly think about is that language don't die because of their own willpower, right? They die because people choose to leave them behind. And a lot of times that choice is not made because we want to. When we take a look at that social engineering that took place with the boarding school era, when we look at what's going on in terms of historical trauma, but what we need to also take into consideration as we look at, right, the ramifications from history, the ramifications from historical trauma, the ramifications from trauma itself, right, is that we as individuals have an opportunity, right, to not leave language behind. And so that's the first step, is that we have that personal accountability. So what do? We use the language every day, right? Small steps. Start personally, right? Then you build your circle of language learners. How do you start? You know, we have search for programs. YouTube has been phenomenal. There's this, I'm going to be posting a couple for you guys to take a look at over the next couple days, right? But even looking up songs or lessons, there's so much that is found beyond Rosetta Stone. I remember when I started looking at language revitalization programs, Rosetta Stone was like the go-to and the only. And the only thing is that it was a tremendous amount of money. And then I had to have a laptop that functioned and was compatible with it, which I still haven't gotten set up. But those are the things that, you know, stop us. Well, don't let us stop us. How do we find those things? How do we find, you know, songs? I found that learning children's songs and children's stories really help to build up confidence, not just language speaking confidence, but cultural confidence. And so, and working with not just by yourself, but, you know, take classes. I'm not saying if you go to, you know, Mr. Thomas Littleben's Navajo 101 class that you will leave that class as a fluent speaker. But what I will tell you is that his class is designed and structured to start giving you stepping stones, right? I truly, honestly believe that those classes, even by learning your clans, and I know that we spend all of Navajo 101 learning our clans and pronunciations and going over these different types of sounds, but they really become key in terms of how powerful, right, it is to know your clans and to learn who you're related to. Right. So I know we get tired sometimes when we're sitting in those classes and we're like, I don't know how I'm related to that clan, or I don't want to say my clans over again. But when we really start to break down those areas, it's truly a wonderful window of opportunity. And so take advantage of that, utilize those spaces as stepping stones, right? Now, these classes aren't an end all be all, right? You won't get a sense of it until you are out in real world experiences, right? But they're great stepping stones to be in. So another thing that we can do is learn a word, use a word, teach a word. I use this all the time. My husband is actually the one who taught me this. He learn one, do one, teach one is his mantra, right? So whatever I need to learn, he teaches it to me. I learn it, and then I'm responsible for doing it the next time, but then I have to teach someone else how to do it. So even a lot of my classes are structured like that, especially my cultural arts classes, where you learn how to do pottery, then you do pottery all by yourself, and then you're responsible for creating a lesson plan or for teaching somebody else how to make that particular piece. And then you start moving on, right? Move away from a word and start looking at phrases, right? Learn a phrase, use the phrase, teach someone else the phrase. I've been very fortunate that I have two little boys who are in this sponge mode, and so being able to just give them a phrase a day, a word a day. Right now, I'm trying to get them to stop saying the sh word, but so in English anyway. But if you know you start to use one, and slowly it starts to become part of your process, right? And so those are the things that we can start doing. Another thing that we can take a look at is that reintegration with our culture. Language and culture are intertwined. It's not just coming from a personal philosophy, but it's also anthropologically sound, as well as coming from Native American studies, right? Use your language in the communities. And the hardest part about that, and trust me, I understand it, is mispronouncing something, right? Is saying something wrong. But as was explained in the video, right? If we're not corrected, right, we're not going to change. So instead of using it as a moment to feel bad about ourselves, right? Because we can very easily fall into that, like so-and-so just corrected me, I'm never going to say that word ever again, right? I'm never going to, I'm done. I can't get the pronunciation, right? You can utilize it as a memory block to be like, oh, I don't say it this way, I say it this way, right? Or as a challenge to yourself to start to build up that confidence. So those are the things that we need to really look at. And for older generations, criticizing younger generations, we need to take into consideration what is that older generation's responsibility, right? Well, they don't speak that language, they're lazy. Well, then how can you provide them tools or space? So at least you can say, right, that, well, and not that I tried, right, but that I do, right? This is what I do. It's not like I tried and I give up. You provide an environment for them, and it's up to that individual then to take advantage or not take advantage. But at the same time, you continue to use a word, right? You continue to use your language every day. And the same account for our younger generations that don't speak the language, right? And our younger generations could be in our 50s, right? You know, we understand that there's a lot of blame to place, and we understand that there's a lot of resentment in areas. But how do we work through those psychological barriers, right? Those psychological noises in order to critically think about and critically listen to the significance of our language, then come up with a plan and start to pick it up word by word, phrase by phrase, little by little. And so those are the kinds of things that we think about when we think about discard. When we think about language and colonization and decolonization, we start to find out, all right, well, where do I fit? And so some of the things that I really want you guys to think about today, I know that was a lot, is where do I fit? Where do I find language revitalization in terms of my own personal belief? Where is my fluency level? Do I think it's important, right, for me to increase my fluency level? Do I think it's important for younger generations, right, below me to also take care of those areas as well? So that's what you want to think about. Those are the kinds of questions that you want to ponder over the next week. We're actually spending language as the entire week theme, so you guys will have that to take a look at. So I hope you guys have a great day. And if you have any questions, make sure that you reach out and you get in contact with me, and I will try to help you guys out the best that I can. All right, guys, you have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.